Welcome everyone to my how-to video on creating the visual design of your resume. So what I'm looking at here is a pretty traditional resume design, and it's really easy to follow. It has a nice use of contrast. It's nice and balanced in terms of the amount of text versus white space. So you can clearly see that there's some specific details in here, but it's not so crowded that your reader is going to feel overwhelmed. So the guiding principle for creating the visual design of a resume is to make it easily scannable. Basically meaning if your recruiter or the person reviewing your application only takes 6 seconds to look at your resume, we need to be able to make sure that their eye is drawn quickly and easily to the information that they need. And we do that by employing certain visual design elements. Okay, so based off of this design, I can easily find the kind of experience I'm looking for: clinical experience, research experience, shadowing, publications. I can even find the specific experiences because the first line is bolded and the position title is italicized. And then there's easy spacing between each section. So it's very easy for me to locate the kind of information I'm looking for. So that's what this video is going to be about. To learn more about what content to put into your resume, you can check out my other video on that. Okay, so first, before we get started, let's just review what the visual design concepts are. And to get to them, we're looking at our assignment 7043 assignment page. And if you scroll down to the bottom, the tasks for attendees, so remember that in this assignment, we have been hired to create example job application materials for a training program. And so we're supposed to follow the same steps as the trainees, and one of those steps is to review the visual design concepts and employ them in our design. So if you click on this link right here, that will open up this page. You can always just do a search up here in the search bar for visual design, and that will pop up. Okay, so this is the page, and it explains proximity, contrast, repetition, and alignment. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this as I've went over this previously, but just to review. So looking at our example here, contrast is anything that causes one set of text to stand out against others. So it increases or decreases the density of the ink compared to other text or against the white of the page. So for example, our section headings are all bolded, all caps, and their font size is larger. All of that is contrast. Sarah Smith, the name, is clearly in a different font style. That's a form of contrast. Even the lines and the bullet points are a form of contrast because it increases the difference in ink versus other text or versus the page. Italicizing is even a form of contrast. It kind of makes it thinner and wispier, but I can clearly tell the difference between this style of text and, say, the text normally we write with. Okay, so that's contrast. The next thing is I like to explain proximity and alignment together. So proximity is the vertical space on the page. So anywhere you have extra space between sections, that is a use of proximity. If you have extra space in between items within a section, that is a use of proximity. And so basically adding a little bit of vertical white space allows your reader to easily skip to new sections, okay? And that is part of what makes it very easily scannable. Now, alignment is the opposite of that. It is the horizontal space on the page. So this is where, so for example, Sarah Smith and the email address and phone number are centered, versus these two are left aligned and right aligned. So this is also anytime you use tabs. So if you tab over your bullet points instead of having them all the way to the left, that's a use of alignment. Okay, so sometimes you might see the position title tabbed over one to differentiate it a little bit better. Notice that our dates are right aligned. That's a choice of alignment. Alternatively, you could left align the dates and then move the tab over so that they are left aligned along this line here as opposed to right aligned. Okay, So repetition is the fourth concept, and it's basically just making sure that we are repeating all of those choices for the same kind of information. So for example, notice that the second line under clinical experience is italicized, but the second line under education is not. And so that would be an error in repetition. It's not repeating the same visual design concepts in the same way. And so they may have a good reason for that, but it isn't consistent. Okay, so those are the four visual design concepts that we'll be using, and I will take you through how to create your own. Okay, um, so what I'm going to do next is look at some examples. So if you go into our Moodle, there are a bunch of examples that you can check out. Let's see, I think you have to click on here it is. So under task for attendees, if you click on resume gallery, this page will pop up, and it has a few examples that are all very traditional visual designs, just slightly different from one another. Alternatively, if you go to our BTW Moodle, so our course Moodle, and go under week 3, you'll find a file folder that I've added with a whole bunch of examples ranging from very traditional to very visually appealing. So I'm going to pull a few examples from my file folder to talk about during this. Okay, navigate back. So if you open up that file, you'll see something like 20 examples. So the first one we were looking at, this is probably the most common visual design, and it's very conventional. So if you're applying to a company that is very conventional or in a field that is very conventional, this is basically what they'll expect to see. Okay, some other variations of that. So notice that this one has 2 columns. So this first column is the section headings, and so some people like that extra white space so that they can find the sections they want more easily. So this is choices in alignment. So this alignment choice creates two columns. It does reduce the amount of space that you have to talk about your experiences. So and just keep that in mind. If you are writing really long bullet points, you probably wouldn't want to go this way, but if your bullet points are fairly succinct, you might like this because then it'll look like you're saying a lot more than you really are. Some other variations. I really like this one because they use this left column for just factoids. So this might be experiences that you don't need to explain a lot. So if you're in computer science, for example, and you have a lot of coding, this would be really great because it draws your eye to these lists. So you could list all the programs or languages that you know. Education, if you have a whole lot of work experience, you can put all that over here and then just briefly mention your degrees over here. So I like this this aspect for, say, if you want to show off a lot of lists that you have, like listed skills, especially if it's like computer programs or something like that. And then clearly over here, I don't really like how crowded the right column looks. So I would probably just take the more traditional example. So I'd probably just take this and move it into the right column of this design. But this is really great because it's still fairly traditional and fairly expected, but it allows you to list important skills and it'll draw more attention to it than just putting it at the bottom. Something else I want to draw your attention to here is there is some issues in consistency or repetition. Notice that the bullet points change section to section. So we have these bullet points and then even the alignment is different here than say down here where they're using dash lines and the alignment is different. And so that just seems kind of weird and random. And so again, the bullet points and the alignment changes. They're not indented the same. And so that change in repetition for little reason seems odd. And again, there's just so much text in this. But notice that they do try to use contrast so that your eye is drawn to the sections. I do like that it uses this gray bar for the section headings, so that also helps break up the text a little bit more. So whatever your case may be, if you have very little information, there is a design for you. If you have a whole lot of information that you need to get on there and you just can't pare it down any further, you can use contrast and alignment to help set your information apart more and can allow your reader to scan it just a little bit more easily. So imagine if you didn't have this gray bar here, or you didn't have the bolding here. It would be very dense and your reader would not want to see any of that. We also have like this randomly as opposed to another bar. It's just very random, but I do like this column, this two-column structure, and putting list type information over here. Okay, so that's one example. Another traditional example, or a little bit more visually interesting. So this is still a little bit traditional, but it's just a little more edgy, so it's a little more visually appealing. So again, it has that kind of cool column over on one side with lists of information. And then it just introduces a little bit of visual design with that light blue color. And I like how they integrated it into the name with a light blue for the first name and a dark blue, because this really makes your name pop. If anything pops in your resume, you want your name to pop, because if you make it to the interview, they're probably doing a lot of interviews and they'll want to glance down and be able to remember what your name is. If they don't remember your name after looking at your resume, that's a pretty bad sign. So I don't particularly like how they emphasize the dates here. I don't think that's very important, so I would probably switch this information up to be like the position title instead. But I do like the use of this light blue. It's not too in your face, but it is a little bit edgy. So if you're applying to a company that is a little newer and they're looking for fresh ideas, you might try something that's just a little bit more visually interesting. And then I want to show you a couple that I really don't like. So I really don't like this design. It's interesting, but it looks a lot more like a newspaper ad. Notice that there is just different formatting section to section. So this one is all centered. This one has these interesting bullet points. This one is all centered. And it's just like this perfect square. I don't know where I'm supposed to look. Everything is equally important visually. And so they're not really telling the reader where their eyes should go first. And so that's problematic. So remember that some of your information is going to be more important to some jobs than others. And you'll want to be able to differentiate which information, which section is most important, or else your reader is just not going to feel very interested. So you want to draw their eye to one section in particular first. Okay, so that's the reason I don't like this one. It's just a little too even. And then let me look at one more example that I don't like too much. This one is just really, there are certainly worse examples, but this one is just a lot of text. And they do try to break it up with some contrast here and with some bullet points, some traditional bullet points. But by the time we get there, as we saw from the 6-second heat maps, they may not be interested in a lot of this information. They're not going to read it. And so what's the point of having all this text if someone's actually not going to take the time to read it? This is the sort of density that you want in your job application letters, not in your resume. You want your resume to be easily scannable. Okay, so that just I took you through some examples, and you're welcome to take a look through that file folder and see which ones you like and play with it. You can also always go into Microsoft Word and check out their templates. So if you try to open a new document, create a new document, you can do a search here for resume and see what kind of templates they have pop up. Now, the one warning I will give on resumes, resume templates or Word document templates, is that they can be a little difficult to adjust. So if you don't if you want to change something, like you want to add a section or change a section or change the shape of a section, it can be a little difficult to adjust it to your design ideas. But if you like their design, like you might really like this one, it's fairly traditional. I've seen people use this example in applying for jobs. If you just want to keep to that design, feel free to use one of these that you think is visually appealing. So yeah, like this one is terrible. It just doesn't pop very much. Okay, so that's one way that you can check some things out. So I'm going to take you through creating your own. And so I always highly suggest that you use a table, because if you just try to use like tabs, um, and then you tab over, um, and then you tab over and you put your date, and then all of a sudden you need to change this and your job title needs to be much longer. It's going to move all the rest of your line over, and it's going to cause you a lot more work to have to adjust it. Sometimes it'll cause your date to go down to the next line, and then you have to figure out how to get the spacing just right. So I always recommend that people start with a blank table. And so I've already got us started here. So basically, I've got a simple 2-column table. And I personally don't like right aligning my dates. I don't like how the left side is kind of all over the place. So I like having a second column so I can left align these and they're all flush to the left, and just tabbed over more. Okay, so this is a fairly traditional, I'm kind of recreating our first example here. So um, that's what I'm kind of doing on my own. And so once you have your own built this way in a table, you can easily change any of this information and it won't mess with the alignment of your date over here. So one thing that is problematic of what I've already built here is, let's say I want this line to go really long, and I have a lot to say about my skills and everything. Well, it's going to cause me to take up a lot more lines than if it could go all the way across. So instead, what I can do is take this line here, this row, right click and merge cells. So now I have a really long line, and I'm going to take my descriptors because I want those to be super long. I'm going to cut that and paste it, oops, right down here. I lost my bullet point. There it is. So now I have this merged cell right underneath the date, and so now I can have as long of a line as I want to. And it'll go all the way underneath the date, as opposed to up here, which it won't allow me to go underneath the date. So that's the one thing I would adjust about this template. I would have my bullet points in its own row where it just has one column there. Okay, so once you get this set up, it's a lot easier to use after that point. Notice that the contrast that I'm starting to use is my section headings are bolded, all caps, and you can even make them a little bit larger if you want to and you have the space for that. This is a pretty common visual contrast that I'm setting up here. So having my employer or my education organization bolded, and then having my degree or title italicized underneath that line, and then bullet pointing what you did. So this is what I may have referenced in a previous video about, let's say you don't have a lot of work experience, but you've got really relevant classwork experience. So let's say the job you're applying for is an internship and they want to see research experience. So you can have a section on research experience and talk about research projects you worked on in a class. And so you would treat it just like you do a job. So you would have the university as the place where you had this experience, and then you would cite the class name where you have your job titles, and then underneath that just describe what you did. If you actually published a paper, you could say published a paper, and then what the title of it was. about, and you can describe it if you need to. So you can just describe what you did, describe your research skills, whatever skills that you think is important to show off. So if I would only recommend that you do this with a couple of classes that show off very like high level projects. Okay, you would only want to do this with really high level projects. But if you have, so that's only if you're trying to show off skills that you obtained, but you only have them from classes and you haven't tried them out in the workplace yet, and you know that there's something that you have to be able to do for the job in order to get it. But if you've got internship or work experience in which you practice those skills, I wouldn't do the class then. I would just talk about those skills as part of your job. Okay, so this is all made up information, but it kind of shows you how the visual design can be applied section to section. And I like to leave a little bit of white space in between each of my sections, or even within between content within my sections. So maybe you have like a really tight resume. You can always reduce the amount of space. So I'm going to highlight this and change. Yeah, so if you reduce the size of the font, it'll make that space very small. But you still have that little bit of white space and it looks nice. I would just recommend that the space between sections be larger than the space within sections. Because the more space suggests that you're about to change information to a greater degree than when there is smaller space in between information. So this is the traditional one. And now I'm going to show you the column one. So I'm going to move over to another Word document. And so as you can see, I have the same information, but now I have it broken up where I have that second column with just the section headings. And notice, I don't know if you can tell, but this is actually a completely different font style. So my information, my work experience and stuff is all in Times New Roman, and this is in Garamond, all caps. And so is my name. So it kind of just has a slight visual variation, and so it might draw your eye a little bit more. And notice that I've made my name much bigger in this example, so that it pops out a lot more. And so notice that there's less space here, but you may like that. And so this is kind of like a neat, clean structure as well. Notice I had to change the formatting of my dates so that I could get more space. Other than that, you may be asking, well, what about all those lines? How do I get rid of those? And so all you have to do is highlight your table and head over here to Design and click on Borders and No Borders. And then all of a sudden you have this very clean, neat resume, and no matter how much information you change, it will never mess with your alignment, okay? And so I've seen some people actually make this kind of shaded and interesting, but I'm going to erase these borders as well. So no borders. Now there's one more thing I want to show you about borders, and it's kind of interesting. So I just put this line in here in between my tables by basically doing the lowercase dash and then hitting return. It'll do it automatically. So for example, dash, 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 dash. So this is shift dash and do it at least halfway through the page and then hit enter, and then it creates this line. But let's say you want lines in between and you've got this table. This can be a little finicky if your resume is longer than a page, but since we are not going to do that, this should be a lot easier. So go to Design and you want your border painter. So notice the little dotted lines show you where the lines are, and I want to have a line right before my section changes. So I'm going to paint this. You just click on it with the paintbrush, and ta-da! So double click off to the side, and there's a line separating my section. So you can decide which lines in particular you want to be visible and which lines you don't. Okay? So that is probably the best advice I would give for creating your own visual design, is use a table. And the only thing you need to be able to do then is make the borders invisible, and then you can always play around later with making some of the lines visible and others not. All right, so I hope that this video was useful, and if so, you can check out my others. If you have any questions about particular things you want to do in your visual design of your resume, you can always bring those to our virtual classroom or send me an email. Good luck.